Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. In our last episode, King George VI passed away in his sleep after having health issues. Needless to say, it was a shock to the royal family. Queen Elizabeth was now known as the Queen Mother, a title she wasn't fond of. She felt alone without her husband, who she shared almost all her time with. Now she would have to leave Buckingham Palace and find a new place to live. And she also felt lost because she was young when the role of queen was taken away from her. So let's see what she's up to today. Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary remained close to each other and helped each other out, and they consoled each other over King George VI's death. The Queen Mother was concerned that she would now have nothing to do. She was only 51 and much younger than Queen Alexandra and Queen Mary when their husbands died. She did not feel ready for the relatively retired life that they led in widowhood. They both continued to carry out public engagements and to support their favorite charities. Neither had sought any constitutional role. Queen Elizabeth wanted to be able to act as counselor of the state when the Queen was away, just as she had during the King's reign. There was a problem, and under the existing legislation, after the death of her husband, she was no longer eligible to serve in this capacity. Lascelles thought it would be both right and proper to change the law in the Queen Mother's favor, and with the agreement of the Queen, he immediately wrote to the Prime Minister and the Lord Chancellor to ask if it could be done. It could, and in April the Queen approved a submission from the Prime Minister proposing to amend the Regency Act and to include the Queen Mother's name following that of the Duke of Edinburgh and before the other chancellors. It was a slow process, and the new Regency Act did not pass into law until November 1953, and it contained another new departure. The Duke of Edinburgh was designated regent in case Prince Charles should succeed before the age of 18, instead of Princess Margaret, who, under the 1937 Act, would have become regent. The Queen Mother was concerned about the Duke of Edinburgh. She asked that he be able to play a part in the coronation. Lascelles suggested that the prince should be made chairman of the Coronation Commission, and this was done. She found herself in conflict with her son-in-law over the name and style of the dynasty. When Prince Philip's wife was to become queen, it made Philip's life very difficult. He had been head of his young family. Now his wife was taken over by the court of her father. The private secretary, the keeper of the privy purse, the treasurer, the master of the horse, the surveyor of the Queen's pictures, all of these and many more wanted to serve their new monarch and wanted her to see them do so. They wanted access to the Queen, not to her husband. Prince Philip saw himself as a man first and a prince second, and he wanted recognition as head of his family. He felt the children should be given his last name. He had taken the family name Mountbatten when he became a naturalized British subject, but now he proposed Edinburgh as an alternative. Some members of the cabinet suspected the hand of Earl Mountbatten, who was reported to have said that since February 7th, a Mountbatten had sat upon the throne. Queen Mary was dismayed. She believed that her husband had founded the House of Windsor for all time, and she was not prepared to see the name changed to Battenberg or Mountbatten. The Queen Mother agreed with Queen Mary. The cabinet took the same view as the two Dowager Queens and insisted to the new queen that her family must be known as Windsor. It was not easy for Prince Philip. In the end, largely due to Kiki Mountbatten's insistence, a compromise was agreed. The name Mountbatten Windsor was adopted to be used in the future for those of the Queen's descendants who were not entitled to be called Royal Highness. The name of the royal house remained Windsor. The Queen Mother not only had to change her residence, but also her household, as was customary. Everyone formally resigned at the end of the reign, but she was anxious to keep many of the same people around her. She invited Lord Airlie to remain as her Lord Chamberlain, and he accepted, ready to serve her at her pleasure, but reminded her, "Your Majesty will not forget the telegram, 'Be off when your Majesty has had enough of me.'" The Queen would have much more for her to do, and money would always be a problem. On her widowhood, her civil list allowance for her official duties was fixed at £70,000 a year. It remained at this level for the next 20 years. It said when you're in shock, it dulls grief, and when the shock of the King's death began to wear off, the Queen Mother felt unhappy. She wrote to her brother David that she could not envision life without the King. He was such a big part of one's life, and things can never be the same again without his energy and fun and goodness and kindness. He really was the kindest and most selfless person I've ever known. At the moment, one can simply not take any interest in anything. To LaSalle, she wrote that a beautiful day is almost unbearable, and it seems to make everything 1,000 times worse. I suppose it will get better some day, and she appreciated the rallying of her friends. She wrote thanking Bobbetty Salisbury for his comforting letter. She said the king was so wonderfully better, and for that I am very grateful, because he was so gay and so full of plans for the future, and I am quite sure did not contemplate death coming so soon. I had so hoped that he might have had a few years when he could have eased up a little and done some of the things he loved doing, such as planting gardens and vistas and changing all the pictures around, and had perhaps some less violent and uneasy years in contrast to the last rather terrible 12, but it was not to be. At the moment everything seems very pointless, but I'm sure that one must not be too sorry for oneself. It's like looking in the glass when one is weeping. It makes everything much worse. And her friends did all they could. The Queen Mother would go visit her friend Doris Finer just to be alone with kindness and companionship she had known almost all her life. Doris knew how much the Queen Mother needed the king, and she commented that without him, her mainspring had gone. Doris told mutual friends whom she trusted that although everyone thought that the Queen had energized the king and kept him up to his work, in fact the opposite was true. The initiatives almost always came from the king. He had to make the decisions, and now she was quite lost without him. The Queen also became more dependent on her own family, particularly her brother David, who helped to put her life and finances in order and perspective. She told him, "Now that Bertie has gone, you are the only person to whom I can turn. Thank you again, darling, for all your angelicness. Your loving Elizabeth." She rarely let her grief show, and her ladies-in-waiting saw little of her anguish. Katie Seymour, who had known her since they were both in their teens, wrote, "She varies from day to day, never shows anything but supreme self-control. If she did break down, she was embarrassed." One letter helped her. It was from Lord Davison, who sent her his account of how he had encouraged the nervous Duke of York to pursue his quest for her in 1922. Davison said that he had kept the story in secret recesses of his memory, and it was only now releasing it because, in your Majesty's terrible loneliness, I believe that it may bring you one tiny grain of comfort. And she thanked him warmly. "As you told me your story so well and so delicately, I must tell you that we were ideally happy, due to the king's wonderful kindness and goodness and thought for others. I never wanted to be with anyone but him." Her mood, as to be expected, changed all the time. At the end of April, she went to dinner with friends, and according to Osbert Sitwell, a sudden roar went up at the dining table, which he took to be an indication of delight from everyone that the Queen Mother was among them once more. She thought that the noise was so terrific and the plunge for me so sudden that I felt slightly bewildered. Her first major official engagement after the death of the king took place on May 13, 1952. It was an initiative of her own. She had always made a point of trying to see her regiments before they were sent off overseas, and when she heard that the 1st Battalion of her beloved Black Watch had been ordered to the war in Korea, she asked if a visit to the battalion could be arranged for her. Despite a bad cold, she flew to Scotland to inspect in the McCrail camp in Fife, and she was dressed in black, and she wore the diamond regimental brooch that General Sir Archibald Cameron had presented to her when she became Colonel-in-Chief in 1937. 500 men paraded before her, each wearing a black armband, and she praised the regiment so dear, as she said, to my heart and to many of my family. She then met relatives and old comrades and visited the sergeant's mess and lunched with officers before flying back to London. On May 23rd, she and Princess Margaret had an adventure. Together with the Lord and Lady Salisbury, they visited the de Havilland factory near Hatfield and were taken for a 4-hour flight in the Comet. It was a revolutionary jetliner over Geneva and Mont Blanc. The Comet flew over Italy and north of Corsica as well, and they reached 500 miles an hour, and Queen Elizabeth asked how fast they could go. The pilot suggested she push the control column forward until they reached 525 miles per hour, touching the red danger section on the speed indicator. The airplane began to porpoise, showing it was at its limit. And then it was found out later that comets had structural weakness which led to fatal crashes until the fault was put right. Queen Elizabeth was unperturbed by the aircraft's erratic movement, and the Queen said, "The Viking will seem a little slow after this. We exceeded a reading of Mach 0.8 at 40,000 feet. What the passengers thought, I really would not like to say." So I will end the video on the Queen's taking over the controls. I love that. She was fearless. The Queen in this episode had to deal with so many changes in her life. She had to figure out where she was going to live. She worried that she wouldn't have anything to do, but she did manage to change the law and be available to fill in for her daughter, the Queen, when she was away. The Queen Mother was lonely without her husband, and it seemed that he was a comfort for her as she was to him. Luckily, she had her family and her friends to console her during her time of grief. The Queen, by the end of the video, decided to have dinner out with friends for the first time since her husband's death, and the roar at the table with excitement at her being there was a shock to her and a few others at the table. She then decided to meet her regiment before they went to Korea, and then she was sent on an airplane where they went over 500 miles an hour, pushing it to its limits, and the plane made a weird motion, but the Queen wasn't afraid. She even took the pilot's controls for a moment and excitedly sent a radio message to number 600 Squadron of the Royal Auxiliary Air Force at Biggin Hill, of which she was honorary Air Commodore. She said, "I'm delighted to tell you today I took over as first pilot of the command aircraft." So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated, and it would help my channel to keep on growing. I would like more people to see the videos and enjoy finding out more and more about the royal family. It's a very interesting topic, and I appreciate all my loyal viewers that I have now. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.